Good day. Back when this channel started up, I wanted to do book reviews. Why? Because my favorite form of media is, of course, the novel. And, well, I did a few novel reviews here and there, but they took a great amount of time, and as time would go on, I would have less and less time to spend on them, as game reviews take far less time and far less effort than a novel review does. But I have since decided to bring back the novel review, although I am changing the format considerably. Instead of the overly produced novel reviews of the past, we're just sticking with a quick and simple podcast-styled novel review, where I spend 6 minutes talking about the book and no more. Why? Because ultimately all you want to know is the book good or bad, and so I'm simply simplifying it to where I say, is it good or is it bad? Although really I'm going to be focusing on just good books. Really, looking at bad books doesn't really help you pick out a good book to read, now does it? So without further ado, let's take a look at the very first novel review, 1901. What if? That is the chief question of alternate history. What if an event went a little differently? What if a person who died didn't? The genre itself is a little better represented in the popular consciousness today than it was a few years ago. The video game Wolfenstein New Order and the TV show Man in the High Castle are two of the most well-known and the most popular of the alternate history stories. They belong to a subset of alternate history called ASB, or Alien Space Bat. This term comes from the 1632 book series by Eric Flint. In that series, a town called Grantville, circa year 2000, was transported to the year of 1632 by aliens that looked like bats, hence the term ASB. ASB refers to any alternate history story that would require massive amounts of external aid to make any sense. The story we are looking at today is right on the cusp of ASB. It's a story that makes logical sense to a degree, but is so unlikely as to be, well, almost impossible. Today, we are taking a look at 1901 by Robert Conroy. Robert Conroy is himself well known for alternate history works that are fun, but not necessarily plausible. And this book is more or less a fun book, but not really a plausible one. 1901 chronicles the story of a German invasion of the US in 1901. This was based on some plans drawn up by the German General Staff during this time period. As history would show, they never invaded, and even if they tried it, things would likely go about as well as they do in the book. So what happens is this. Kaiser Wilhelm II feels that America is getting too imperialistic for Germany's taste and thus sends them an ultimatum, saying that unless the US gives up all overseas colonies and disbands the US Navy, Germany will invade. As you would expect, the US tells the Kaiser where he can put his ultimatum, and thus Germany invades. They make landfall in New York City and plan on holding it until the US gives them what they want. This is not quite as outlandish as you might think. Back during the early 20th century, the United States military was nowhere near as large as it is today. Really, they only had an army of about 100,000 men, and those were not all that well equipped. In fact, during the Spanish-American War, many troops just had trapdoor Springfield single shots. And in this novel, many of the troops have trapdoor Springfield single shots, whereas the Germans have modern-day Mauser rifles, modern-day artillery, and machine guns. The novel itself is very compelling in that the US is just weak enough and the Germans are just strong enough that for a while at least they are evenly matched. The overall writing style is that of an 80s adventure novel and actually has some pretty snappy and at times funny writing. There are a few info dumps here and there, but the novel mainly relies on its characters to give the reader information as to what's happening, and thankfully the novel actually gives you the big picture. The characters themselves are fairly well written, and while they are based on just general archetypes, they show that general archetypes are popular for a reason, and they are enjoyable to read about. The Germans are handled in a very fair manner. They are of course the villains of the novel, and they act villainously now and again. But they are still portrayed as human beings. There are some good Germans, and there are some bad Germans, and there are actually a great many sympathetic German characters to be found in the novel. Kaiser Wilhelm II does not get a flattering portrayal whatsoever. He is a complete and total Saturday morning cartoon villain that rants and raves all the time and has some really, really idiotic ideas. Now, whether or not the real Kaiser Wilhelm II was actually that bad, I couldn't really say. He, of course, was very, very, shall we say, emotionally compromised. He had a great many emotional problems stemming from the fact that his hand was withered, and he would try to hide it throughout his life, and this withered hand would cause him to be a bit bellicose, and by a bit bellicose, I mean really bellicose and really dumb. He was actually the one who dismissed Otto von Bismarck, which was probably one of his dumber moves. And by 1908, he had messed up so much that he lost most of his influence, and by World War I, he wasn't really leading much of anything. In fact, towards the end of World War I, Erich Ludendorff and Paul von Hindenburg were the ones actually leading Germany. So while the Saturday morning cartoon Kaiser might be a little bit overblown, it's not that far from the truth. The novel does not shy away from many of the social and racial issues of the day, and treats them with respect but does not belabor the point. Later in the novel, a cool Native American character is brought in to really mess up some Germans, but he is kept sympathetic and has actually developed fairly well. Overall, the whole package is what I like to call a 3 o'clock read. It's a book good enough to keep you up past 3 o'clock wanting to know what happens. The characters are fun and sympathetic, the hero's heroic, the villains, if not 3-dimensional, then at least are 2.5D, and in the end, this is just an enjoyable read all around, and I highly recommend giving it a try. And so, I am GeneralLotz, wishing you good Red Storm Rising, and good 1920, America's Great War, or whatever makes you happy. If you enjoyed my review of 1901, please consider subscribing, and if you can, please consider supporting me on Patreon so that I can continue bringing you these great book reviews.